Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nora Valenzuela. I'm the chair of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees and Executive Board, I wish to welcome all of you, our wonderful and loyal members from Southern California. And also we have guests from all over US joining us today. So welcome. We will be starting our program with introducing our moderator, Rick Putnam, who's a member of our Board of Trustees and also the vice chair of the program committee. And Rick will be reviewing with you the ground rules or rules of engagement. So for submission of your questions and also how you will engage with our speakers today. And then he will be introducing our wonderful, great speakers. I know you said to call you Sam, but I'd rather call you Dr. Brannan at this time and introduce you and welcome you to have a virtual visit with us in Southern California today. Upon the completion of the presentation, Tom will be doing the QA and we will be going into the wrap up after that. So welcome everyone, enjoy and learn. It's going to be a very informative session and I'll turn it over to Rick. Rick?
Thank you, Nora. Thank you very much. And welcome everybody in the audience and particularly to Director Sam Brannen for joining us today. Just a note on the format, I'll be essentially just sort of moderating a discussion with Sam, but the audience is very much encouraged to submit questions via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And my colleague Tom will be sorting through those and getting those out to Sam at the end of the session with about 10 minutes left or so.
Yeah, there's actually a button for Q&A. If you guys could use the Q&A button, please.
Perfect. And as a reminder, we are a nonpartisan organization and do keep our topics and questions and directions in a sort of non-political way as much as we can. So please respect that as you submit questions. And we'll begin now first with an introduction of Sam. And I'm pleased to introduce Director Sam Brannen, who's had quite a bit of experience in both public and private markets and companies, essentially looking over the macro trends that affect both private firms and governments throughout the world. Today, he leads the Risk and Foresight Group of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and is a senior fellow in the International Security Program. He previously served as a long-range strategic planner advisor to senior leaders in government and business. And the newly established Risk and Foresight Group at CSIS is charged with providing decision makers with insights into the forces of change reshaping the global environment from shifting demographics to emerging technologies. He returned to the CIS in the fall of 2018 after spending 4 years as the director of A.T. Kearney's Global Business Policy Council, where he advised CEOs on many of these long-range planning macro trends. He's also held multiple positions at the Pentagon, including advising on strategy and foresight issues and serving as the Turkey desk director. And during 2009 to 2011, I believe visited Turkey at least a dozen times, 14 times or so in that capacity. He holds a master's degree in international affairs from the George Washington University and a BA in poli-sci from Trinity University in Texas. A native of Santa Fe, New Mexico, Sam is calling in today from Arlington, Virginia, where he lives with his wife and 2 young children, and his collection of half a dozen grills in the backyard for cooking. So with that, welcome, Sam. And we've got a great program today, in part based very much on the 7 Revolutions initiative, which CIS is responsible for with all its great resources. And maybe you can just start out with that, a description of the initiative for our viewers.
Great. Thank you so much, Rick, and thanks for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. Our time a little bit later in the afternoon. And Rick, I think you can be my official biographer. That was you worked through a lot of very thick words related to past titles with aplomb. So I appreciate that. The Seven Revolutions initiative that Rick referred to is an effort that has been under multiple custodians now at CSIS. It goes back to 1993 when we marked the 30th anniversary of our organization. We were founded at the height of the Cold War in 1963. And in 1993, the then president and CEO said, hey, instead of looking backward and congratulating ourselves on what we've done over the past 30 years, let's look forward 30 years and think about what the challenges are of the future that we need to prepare for. So on an evergreen basis since then, we have conducted a scan of the strategic environment and put together a brief that looks across lots of areas of change. That's actually not the brief I'm going to give you today. And the reason for that is straightforward. We are living in a time of unbelievable change. If you think about a year ago, we were just starting to get our hands around the idea of this mysterious virus in China that, of course, has turned our world inside out. If you look 3 weeks ago, we were just trying to understand what had happened in the US Capitol, where a mob had almost for the first time in US history overthrown Congress in a matter of speaking. And if you look at just 1 week ago, we had the swearing in of our 46th president, Joe Biden. And so think about the way that time is moving right now. So if we just look at 2021, I really think this is going to be a hinge year that sets in motion what happens not only this decade, but potentially this century. And so I wanted to share with you today, and I will go ahead and share my screen now, my thoughts on 5 trends that I'm following closely along with multiple colleagues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I have colleagues who are China experts, who are energy experts, who are international security experts, and I have a unique role there where I'm really able to read everything they're putting out and try to connect the dots between these areas where they're diving really deep. And by the way, our analysis is almost all of it is online. We're updating through podcasts, through videos, through papers, through events you can participate on every day. If you go to www.csis.org, I have a paper that's coming out that should be on the website this afternoon looking at future national security challenges. So these are 5 risks in 2021. And I think as I go through these, really think about the connections between them, because none of them stand alone. There's a huge amount of interaction. And so no surprise to you, we start the presentation thinking about the SARS-CoV-2 virus, 1/300th the diameter, the size of a human hair. This is what so many of us have spent so much time over the past year thinking about in a personal way, in a professional way, in a future of our country way. And as I said, it seemed so abstract when a year ago we looked at what was going on in Wuhan, China, this large-scale lockdown, huge loss of life, and it just seemed abstract. Even as experts told us it was coming our way next, we sort of couldn't wrap our heads around it until suddenly sometime in March, our workplaces, for many of us, if we were lucky enough to work from home, looked something like this. They continue through the present, maybe much longer than many of us think. But of course, we've also turned the page in the past 2 months, in the sense that we now have not 1, not 2, but really probably very soon 3 effective vaccines. We're not sure about the Russian and the Chinese vaccines yet, but there will be a number of vaccines that are coming forward. Here's Anthony Fauci getting his Moderna first shot. We have in the past, it had taken the quickest that we'd ever developed a vaccine was 2 years. Some of the vaccines that we developed were literally ready within 48 hours before they went to trials and testing to make sure they were safe and effective. But we're actually sort of bending the curve in the midst of this pandemic in technology and science in ways that we need to appreciate. So we'll turn back to that. But what we really want to get back to is this, right? I mean, I think this either excites you or makes you very nervous to see this many people in one place at one time. And the question is, when can we do this again, and can we do this again? And experts tell us we can, but increasingly it's a complicated picture. Herd immunity is probably going to be in the 75 to 85% range. So either people need to get naturally infected with COVID-19, which is not a desirable course, probably 10% of the U.S. population has that at this point at a high estimate, and we've already lost 400,000 lives. So this is not a tenable solution to get to herd immunity. So we need vaccines to get us there. The smart money is on late 2021 for the United States and perhaps early 2022 for places like Europe that are falling really far behind in their vaccination campaigns early on. But if we're optimists, let's say, sort of the fall timeframe of 2021. Personally, I think it's probably later than that, particularly when we look at some of the new mutations and variants that might require an adaptation of vaccines or a third shot in the 2-course Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that we have out there. But when you look globally, if you're not within one of the richest countries in the world, you're thinking about 2023, if not later than that, before you can get to this sort of herd immunity where life gets back to normal around COVID-19. Seems like a very long time, but I think there are no shortcuts. The scale of the challenge is just massive, particularly in the United States, which is the 3rd most populous country in the world. But I think we're going to see lots of twists and turns all over the world, including even in countries that have controlled the virus well to date. I mean, I think China is one outbreak and mutant strain away from losing that advantage, and they are further behind on vaccination and planning than the United States is in many ways. So we're far from the end of the story here. The other piece of this is the bad news that my colleague Steve Morrison warned actually quite forcefully, I would say, in 2019 with a National Commission on Health Security, that we vacillate in our response to global disease between crisis and complacency. And if you look at this timeline of epidemics from 2000 through now, and the outbreaks of things like SARS, like Ebola, MERS, H1N1 influenza, Zika virus, we see not only that it is more frequent, it's clustering, but that the geography from which this came is also differing. It's Africa, it is Asia, it's all over the world, and so the idea that we could have even overlapping pandemics in the midst of COVID-19 is something that governments, frankly, and health thinkers are really worried about. I've talked to some of the folks who are now on the Biden team, and they think that a once a century epidemic or pandemic like we have with COVID-19 could be much more frequent than that, because the drivers of epidemics, which is in one way the encroachment of humans increasingly on natural habitat all around the world, animal trafficking, and the more frequent interaction between domesticated livestock, humans, and wildlife, even in places like the Amazon, where we've seen expanded agricultural sort of takeover of what used to be natural habitat. All of that is increasing, and climate change is also driving the range in which a lot of these viruses can exist to be wider. And so they're not just coming from tropical locations, which tropical continues to expand. So extremely worrisome, and we need to prepare ourselves to live in this era of epidemics and potentially pandemics, and learn the lessons here about how to avoid exactly what we've just had happen. The next issue, of course, is on the issue of climate change. And this is not exactly new and novel. It's not something you haven't thought of yourself. But here's the basic argument, which is that since the start of the Industrial Revolution, if we go back 400,000 years and we look at the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is the nearest proxy for the effects of climate change, we see that there are ups and downs in the cycle. There are times when Earth itself creates more CO2 through a variety of processes, and there are times when it's lower. But right about the time of the Industrial Revolution, at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, when humans tapped into hydrocarbons to unleash the longest period of human development and economic development in our history, exploded the human population, changed what it meant to be a human on Earth, our quality of life, our opportunities. That is when we saw CO2 start going up in a near vertical climb since the 1950s. And the more energy we bring online, of course, the more economic productivity, but the externalities of climate change are starting to add up, which is why the world came together for the Paris Climate Agreement, where we agreed that we would try to keep mean average annual temperature increase from the beginning of total increase from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution through now. We'd cap it at 2 degrees centigrade. So we didn't want any part of the Earth more than 2 degrees centigrade hotter than it was basically at the beginning of the 1800s. And then we did the math as a scientific community through the UN, through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we modeled out, and we really have great data on this, and we've compared with people around the world. One of the greatest scientific information sharing exercises of all time was looking at this climate data, and it is quite destructive and threatening and economically difficult for our way of life at 2 degrees. They went back and did the math at 1.5 degrees, much better. But here's the bad news is, number one, the good news is the United States is going to rejoin the Paris Agreement and try to hold us to this. This is a voluntary agreement, so it depends on nations signing up themselves to try to reduce their CO2 emissions to try to keep the planet below the 2 degrees centigrade. But already 20% of the planet is above 1.5 degrees centigrade, and 8 to 10% of the planet is above that 2 degrees centigrade. So by the early 2030s, even 2040s, we will be 1.5 degrees, and by 2050, certainly we will be 2 degrees centigrade or more if we don't dramatically shift things. And maybe that's possible this year, and we'll talk about why that might be. Last year, we have the data. It's the second hottest year on record in recorded meteorological data of the Earth. So we're not on a good trend line here. Even, some people made a big deal out of the slowdown in fossil fuel use because of COVID. It really hasn't put a dent into the kind of changes that we need to make. And the math here is basically this. By 2040, if we look at future energy demand for the International Energy Agency, this is assuming we don't make massive policy shifts, which we might, we hope we do, but 78% of our energy will still come from hydrocarbon sources, sources that put CO2 into the atmosphere that create the climate change stresses that we've talked about. Only 22% will come from this rapidly growing area of renewables. And so that is quite a challenge. We are never going to be able to get everything over into that renewable space. It's just impossible. It's too expensive. So what we also need to focus on is carbon capture, sequestration, carbon offsets, anything we can do to get that 78% to be more carbon neutral, meaning we're not putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. So this really is the challenge of a generation. Yeah.
Can you go back 2 slides? And I want to ask you one question on the
sure thing.
One more to the line of 1950. So just to highlight sort of your resources and for any climate skeptics out there, where does the data come from in terms of back 400,000 years? How does the center get that data?
So we pulled this from NASA data and NOAA, so two U.S. government agencies, and they base it on ice core samples that they can get that actually go back that far. That's how they can measure it. They have you can look to some degree in fossil record. There are other things that are probably well beyond my scientific understanding, but this is definitely to show that there are ups and downs. They are measurable, but nothing compares to where we've gone since the start of the Industrial Revolution forward. There are periods in human prehistory where there are probably levels well above this. I'm not sure, we actually have data on it. The bad news is they probably also wiped out or nearly wiped out life on Earth. Those were sort of super volcano incidents or times when you sort of had a catastrophic wipeout of organisms on Earth due to evolutionary patterns that were going on. So, we've gone through 5 great extinctions in human history. We're actually in the midst of the 6th great extinction right now. If you look at the number of plants and animal species going extinct, this is the first time that that's been directly related to one organism on Earth, and that organism is us.
Right. Okay. So as we move through here, then with these impacts, I mean, please continue with the sort of the numbers, but there's going to be some major political and population issues coming out from these trends.
Absolutely, because where the energy demand is coming from is the developing world during this time period. The EU is actually already on course to shrink its carbon footprint. The United States is stabilizing. China continues to grow. India continues to grow. The Middle East, Southeast Asia. So it's also a matter of economic development for much of the world that they at once need to cut carbon emissions and be economically viable and competitive. So it's a global challenge. It's certainly not a developing country only challenge. In many ways, we're uniquely advantaged in the midst of having to do this. It's much more difficult for countries where they're still coming online in terms of energy use and economic productivity. So I think many of you probably noticed that the White House, the new administration, had a big rollout yesterday of climate policy. I think absorbing the magnitude of the shift in US policy is almost mind-boggling at this point, from basically no focus on carbon emissions reduction, focus on energy innovation and technology for sure under the previous administration, but not on this issue of reducing carbon footprint. One of the more striking periods or elements of this administration in its climate policy is that it has linked national security, US national security, to climate policy. And so you may have noticed that the president actually directed his new Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, to the Department of Defense is the #1 user of fossil fuels in the world. And actually the Department of the Air Force is the #1 user within the Department of Defense. And they were directed to dramatically cut carbon emissions. And the Secretary of Defense responded by saying that he thinks that climate security is actually central to everything he does. So former combatant commander of US Central Command, who's fought wars on the ground, is now saying that the next big struggle is not radical terrorism, either in the United States or abroad. His big challenge is climate change, and the role that the Department of Defense is going to play in addressing that. So huge shift, and of course we're leading up to a delayed climate summit. The Global Climate Summit will happen in Edinburgh in the November timeframe of this year. We have a cabinet level official now who sits on the National Security Council, John Kerry, who's taking on climate change. So making climate change national security issue, a big change. Never before have we done it in this way in the United States. It already is that way, I would say, in many other countries. So if you look at Japan, European Union, and the United States all have now in place national strategies to reduce, to be carbon neutral by 2050. China has announced its intent to do that by 2060. So this is actually now a sort of geopolitical competition and an imperative moving forward. We talk a lot, I know you probably have had other speakers in your day-to-day reading come across a lot about artificial intelligence and robotics, quantum computing. You may have spent a lot less time thinking about what technologists tell me is the most decisive single technology of this century, and that is biotech. And this is why. If we look at 2003, one of the great events in human history and science, a milestone, the first sequencing of the human genome, reading the stuff that we're made of. It took about 13 years. It cost $4.8 billion, a lot of it bankrolled by the US government, private industry as well. Now in 2019, so 2 years ago, I don't even have the up-to-date figures for this, but you could sequence the human genome in about an hour for about $100. And so if you look at the speed and the capability there, and you see how fast we're moving in biotech, it's quite remarkable. The co-discoverer of the technology that won the Nobel Prize last year in biology is Jennifer Doudna, who directs a lab at UC Berkeley. And the tool that she created is called CRISPR Cas9. And it is essentially a cut and paste tool. So think about your word processor and the ability to cut and paste in anything you want into that document. That is the tool that she and a French co-winner of the Nobel Prize discovered. It's a cut and paste function that they actually found existing in viruses and used against bacteria. This is something that actually you'll hear more about in coming months, because it's going to be at the center of a new wave of COVID-19 tests that we might even be able to do at home in an entirely new and very precise way. But CRISPR-Cas9 is this Swiss Army knife, the holy grail, and she has spent a lot of time since discovering it thinking about the implications of that discovery. And this hasn't been missed by countries around the world. So even before COVID-19, where the implications of biotechnology and biopreparedness and biothreats are obvious, Jennifer Doudna and her colleagues were raising questions about what it means when humans can control their own future evolution. When truly you can sorry, I've got a 2-year-old who just broke into my room. Yeah. Here, I'll hold him up so I can prove that I'm not just crazy here. He's getting his train book. I could have used some bioengineering on that one to maybe make him more resistant to opening doorknobs by himself. So in any case, this is a technology that has enormous implications. It's out in the wild, and basically, if you have a graduate life sciences degree and you have access to a high school laboratory, you too can modify human genetic material at this point. The other issue that this gives us pause on is this issue of biosecurity. And I am not a conspiracy theorist on the origins of COVID-19, but if you talk to leading virologists and others, could that have escaped a laboratory, not human-made, but accidental? Yes. And as COVID-19 research goes on, and we have a WHO team in China after a very long effort by the Chinese Communist Party, sort of keep them out, and continues to meddle in their work, but we are investigating that, and it's important to understand the origins of the virus to prevent further outbreaks. But this idea that everybody is now doing COVID-19 research, including on mutant strains, it raises the stakes in bio research, biopreparedness around the world. And frankly, we have very weak standards and monitoring around this. We have a lot around nuclear weapons, a lot around a lot of things, but the idea that we could have more things escape the lab as research in biotech, which is one of the hottest fields around the world, picks up, goes without saying. And just to give you an idea, the Abraham Accords between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, the first 2 big business deals on that were investments from the UAE into Israel in the form of biotech. So if you want to know what's on the minds of national governments right now, that is the thing. So this intersects, of course, with an issue we've already alluded to many times, because it's at the center of the world order as we know it, in the changing world order, which is a rising China. And so last spring, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency actually sponsored research that I did, which was a survey of defense experts in the Department of Defense and then outside of the government on what sort of a world order might emerge after COVID-19. And we used scenarios at the time because, of course, it was impossible to predict, but we looked at variables that were high impact and high uncertainty, and we created 4 scenarios around these, and there are videos and more material on the website around it. But suffice it to say that we really did identify COVID-19 as a turning point potentially in world history, and particularly as we thought about things, we said, what are the 2 most critical variables coming out of this? And what we identified was essentially US global leadership, its will to lead, its ability to lead, and Chinese global leadership and influence. And Chinese leadership is different. In many ways, it's much more coercive. The United States leads by power of attraction. In an example, China leads through economic and military power to a much greater degree, depending on the region of the world that you're talking about. And so what we saw was that we could end up with worlds that were very different based on, number one, the recovery from COVID, the economic strength of countries. Number two, the ability to share vaccines and gain power through sharing vaccines globally. And then this idea of how countries might situate themselves in terms of international engagement, will to remain engaged, in terms of technology development, in terms of how COVID might destabilize different regions. And so, a lot of people sort of ask, where are we headed? And I think the good news is that we're far from the worst case scenarios, which at the time where you don't get a vaccine and COVID spreads uncontrolled. Luckily, we've headed that off. We're more in the, both the United States and China will have a vaccine. And so now it really becomes a matter of how quickly can both countries recover, how strong is that recovery, and how do they lead in the world? How do they help others recover and become part of a positive story where people want to align with either the United States or China for commercial, economic, or sort of values related reasons coming out of this. The part of the story here that is not so good for the United States and its closest allies is the economic data that we now see, where China really managed to recover quickly from COVID, to boost its exports to historic highs during this period because of the demand for all of the things that it's cornered in the global manufacturing market, including on the medical and pharmaceutical sides. And the dip has been much stronger for the United States and Europe and Japan, and the story isn't done yet. And if we look at out-year projections as well, we're looking at much slower growth that's been projected by the International Monetary Fund, and actually fairly consistent growth for China compared to what was thought of before. So almost certainly by the end of the decade, China will have the world's largest economy, and that growth could continue to grow somewhat exponentially, depending on how we all do recovering from COVID here. And looking at China's policy during this period, which a number of my colleagues, Scott Kennedy, Jude Blanchette, two of our really good, Bonnie Glaser, really good China scholars, the one thing that we see is that China has really, far from having been chastened by the way that it handled the virus, by its cover-up of the virus early on, by the criticism that it came under, it's really put forward a much more aggressive foot during this time period. And one of the reasons I think principally for that is that China has been, again, able to economically outcompete everyone during this period. They are now, according to UN data that was released just earlier this week, the #1 destination for foreign direct investment in 2020. They shot up about 40% in their foreign direct investment. The United States contracted about 4%, which isn't terrible given the stakes of things, but now China overtook the United States for the first time in this UN data to become the #1 destination. You could see that probably moving forward even more quickly, even as we talk about in countries around the world diversifying supply chains from China. It's not happening. If you look at where the money is going, the investments are going, still going into China. China is still so central on manufacturing. And China has really doubled down on a number of its aggressive policies, whether it's coercion of neighbors, whether it's the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, where it sort of comes off the top ropes, its use of disinformation and misinformation to undermine adversaries, its desire to control digital information internally and externally to its country, its expanded views of sovereignty and its use of changing its own laws, whether it's in Hong Kong or its new data policy laws, to really press its advantage to create a sphere of sovereignty in the interest of its own internal politics that continues to expand out, the growth of state-owned industries. There are questions that my colleagues ask about how sustainable this is. China isn't seeing a rise in its own consumer spending. It's very much export-led, export-dependent. But nonetheless, it has proven its ability, and that its system allowed it to recover with much more agility, so to speak. I mean, sort of like these guys pulling this massive freighter to the dock here. But it's proven itself more agile than Western democracies, again, and big questions about what that means in the world that we live in. Let me just say, you know, a lot of policy questions now for the Biden administration, for Europe, for Japan, for Australia, for everyone who is now responding to an ever stronger China. And this is, my colleague Scott Kennedy did a great job. This is on our website, of breaking down all of the changes in China policy that happened under the Trump administration, and they were huge. Whether you are a supporter or not of President Trump's foreign policy, undeniably, it is probably the largest change in China policy since Nixon, if not Clinton, and sort of opening the door on the WTO. And so what comes next is a huge question. What China most fears is that there will be a multilateral reaction to them. They are not strong enough to take on the world multilaterally. They are very much strong enough to take on much of the world on a bilateral basis. And so they are actively trying to undermine any US-led multilateral approach. And there are big questions to be asked about how the degree to which US allies and partners are actually willing to align with what US policy will be when it comes to China. So big open question, a lot in motion this year. It will be at the center of US foreign policy for sure. And finally, oh yeah, go ahead, Rick.
Sam, as that develops, how do you see pushback actually, you know, being formed from the major other, you know, trading partners and countries around the world who are concerned with multilateralism, and as China looks to delegitimize, undermine, you know, wolf warrior its way through that? Give us some examples of how, you know, how actually pushback happens.
Well, I think, you know, China has shown that there's a huge cost to pushback. If you look at Australia on trade issues, you know, you had criticism, strong criticism from Australia related to some of China's aggression toward neighbors, including Taiwan. And the reaction has been swift, and it's been fairly devastating in a COVID era for Australia in collapsing export of a number of things for which China was the #1 importer. So I think China will not hesitate to use its economic heft as a political tool, economic coercion. It's shown this in a lot of other cases. I think on the European side, you know, you've had some strong talk from the UK on the Hong Kong issue in particular, strong talk from Germany on the Uyghur, and the EU on the Xinjiang issue of Uyghur human rights issues. And there again, China sometimes sort of takes a carrot and a stick. And so instead of pushing back on Europe, what they actually did was negotiate sort of an expanded trade access deal with them before the new Biden administration got into office. And so they're going to play the divide and conquer tool to the extent they can. They're going to use the stick where they think that folks have no recourse, where they really are the prime export destination. They're going to avoid, in any case, trying to sort of galvanize the United States and others together. So they're going to push in some places and sort of pull in others. I think the big area where the competition really is going to be most consequential in this decade is on the issue of next generation digital infrastructure. So 5G networks, cloud computing, AI, all of these things where the United States and China are sort of at the top of the heap, the United States and its allies in China. And they're going to make those decisions tough too. 5G in Germany is a great example, where the Germans want to be on side with the United States, but commercially, it really doesn't make sense for them to turn China away. And in some ways, you know, they don't want to further advantage US tech companies relative to their own companies domestically. So this commercial competition dimension is going to be huge. I think also the green energy dimension is going to be huge. Even for the United States, this is going to be very difficult. So the more that we look at green energy, the more that we actually see that China is manufacturing solar panels in Xinjiang, the exact region using Uyghur labor, where we are now cracking down on human rights. So if we want to meet climate objectives, we have to buy Chinese solar panels. But to do that, we're then undermining our own human rights policy. And they make those calculated decisions, and they make it really difficult on us.
Wow, fascinating.
And so this is, if that's sort of one area of security challenge, the other one is this, which is gray zone competition. And what the gray zone is is we've defined it, a number of my colleagues, including the nominee to be the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, spent several years working on this. So you can guess it's going to be her priority when she goes into the Pentagon. There's what we call a contested arena somewhere between routine statecraft and open warfare. So around the time of the Gulf War, we just marked the 30-year anniversary from the start of the Gulf War a couple of weeks ago. The world noticed that they did not want to take on the United States on the conventional battlefield. And ever since that time, the Russias, the Chinas, the Irans, the North Koreas of the world have been basically ramping up their ability to figure out how to achieve political will without using conventional weapons against the United States. So even as they're building up their conventional arms or nuclear arms in other cases, what they've really focused on is what we call this gray zone operations toolkit. And we see all of these tools that you see listed on the left, and all of these examples on the right of how in both the United States and in Europe, these countries, and again, principally China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, have been able to affect really political outcomes that are internal to our country or to our foreign policy and strategy. And really the only way that we've thought to hit back in many cases is diplomatic sanctions and financial sanctions. And those have proven increasingly ineffective. If you look at the use of sanctions over time, and I should have a graph, it basically looks like this. The more that our adversaries have used gray zone tools, the more we've put sanctions on them, but the more they continue to use these gray zone tools and tactics against the United States and its allies. And so the latest example that we've had is this, SolarWinds, which we heard about late last year. It was the largest hack in US history, maybe in global history. We know that it hit 250 plus US agencies and businesses, that it's about 2/3 of the US economy that was hit, $14 trillion. And we don't even really know what SolarWinds achieved. We don't know what trapdoors were there. We don't know what backdoors are there. We don't even know why the Russians did it. Is it an end to a larger, is it a means to a larger strategic end? Was it something they got lucky with at scale? And what will they do with it going forward? And so that is why the US-Russia relationship, which was already bad, is even worse. And so let me close with this, which is we also are fighting increasingly gray zone tactics at home. And it's not just us. This isn't a US thing. This is actually something we see in countries around the world, which is that domestic political groups, both formal and informal, are copying the tactics of these gray zone actors. So what China and Russia, Iran and North Korea sort of pioneered, others within political systems, within domestic political systems, are starting to adopt these things themselves, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, and the real world consequences are huge. They are turning our politics inside out. They are polarizing the environment. They're creating streams of completely uncivil conflict between different groups within countries. So with that, I've thrown a ton at you. Those are the 5 trends that I'm watching carefully this year, and look forward to discussing it all with you.
That was a great survey, Sam. And I think maybe a theme of what you're talking about is all these trends, especially accelerated with the disruption of COVID, has led us into this a little bit of a feedback loop of, resulting in political extremism, right? That we've seen here in the U.S. One of the 7 revolution impacts that you all look at are issues of human, migration and crises and populations being displaced. Can you give us sort of a little bit of an insight as to where you see those happening, perhaps whether it be at our own southern borders or in places like Africa where the climate has decimated certain areas or other places?
Yeah, so we're already, a couple of years ago, we passed the mark of having the largest number of displaced persons since the Second World War. And we've seen that accelerate. And what you see is within regions because of climate pressures, because of economic pressures, because of criminality, warfare, all of these things that are closely interlinked, you're seeing massive dislocations of populations, where first people move from the countryside to cities, then they move from cities to sort of other border or gateway cities to get out of the country, and then they migrate toward more developed economies where they see greater opportunity. So, we've seen a huge migration crisis over the past several years from the Northern Triangle countries, if you look at our southern border crisis that we've had. And then, of course, during COVID, the complexity is the lockdown that has occurred across many borders. This is the most lockdown borders have ever been, really, since probably since World Wars past. And even then, I think it was probably not as locked down as they are now. So we went from a very globalized world to borders being locked down, things being even harder on migrants. And we see it all over the world. Sub-Saharan Africans moving to North Africa, South Asians and others moving all the way across into Europe from the Middle East. So that really is going to be the story of the COVID recovery area, because we also expect to see really uneven economic recovery, where developed countries will recover sooner because we will have vaccines and we will be able to pump money into our economies, or we've kept them on life support. The economic damage, the longer COVID goes on in most countries, the worse it's going to be, the more that is going to be a driver of migration, and the more difficult it's going to be for those countries to cut carbon emissions, make other investments in the future that will make them more economically competitive, more likely to hold on to people. So as you said, I think COVID has been really an accelerant of many of these negative trends.
And in those areas where those crises happen, certainly, the global threat to the U.S. turns from solving this perhaps, more immediate COVID problem to managing issues that become distracting. We're going to hear from Tom in a moment in audience questions, but I wanted to ask one more sort of thematic topic question, and that is we're going to hear from a speaker soon that talks about sort of the different cohorts of populations throughout the world, especially amongst the great powers. And one theme I've heard is that the U.S. benefits from, will benefit over the next 20 to 30 years from a vastly younger population in that 25 to 40-year-old age category, and therefore supporting an older population, which is in direct contrast to many of our, sort of great power competitors around the world, with the exception of India and Canada, if you can assume them to be competitors. But that the U.S. really has a very bright future from the standpoint of its, economic, heft going forward, just from that very fact. Can you comment on that a bit and prospects?
Yeah, so I mean, we are aging less rapidly than Europe at present, and then Canada, but a lot of that is dependent on projections that assume greater migration and immigration than has taken place, particularly over the last 5 years or so. And so keeping a country young that is a advanced economy is almost entirely dependent on immigration. There is a direct correlation between total fertility rates slow down and GDP per capita in any given country. And so the richer the country is, the less children people have, which is essentially Japan's problem now, where a quarter of the country is over the age of 65. By the end of the century, or by the end of the decade, it'll be a third of the country. And much of the OECD gets there by 2040s or 2050, including the United States gets there a little bit more slowly, but we do need to revisit immigration from a standpoint of economic competitiveness. Obviously, there are other considerations in terms of opportunity you give to existing citizens, and lots of economic development questions that are related. But bottom line is that the demography is pretty clear. We are not getting the sort of birth rates from existing U.S. citizens that we would need to keep the country young, so to speak. We've just gone through, the United States was lucky in the sense that we have sort of baby boomers, a little dip in population with Gen X, and then a boom again with millennials. Now we're going back down with Gen Z. So as millennials sort of move through, we're getting a little bit of a boost. They're reaching their prime working and spending age now, but we have less of them going forward, and the country's getting older because the baby boomers are moving more toward that side of the demographic spectrum where they are less economically productive.
Well, hopefully when we get the bars and restaurants back open, things will begin to look up a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Sam, for that wonderful survey. I want to turn it over to my colleague Tom for audience Q&A now, and then we'll close out.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Sam. We have a number of questions from our audience. So, Sam, we'll challenge you, see if we can do a speed round here and get through. We have 5 in the queue, starting with this from Fernando. What are the expectations for the new administration regarding the China trade war of the past 4 years? Will the tariffs be continued?
I think in some cases the tariffs will continue. I think that the tariffs that are hitting our allies will be things that will be dispensed with quickly. So I think some of the steel and aluminum tariffs that are hitting allies and partners and creating sort of the collateral damage may be dealt away with quickly. The other, sort of the phase 1 trade deal, some of the tighter export controls that we have on China related to technology, those will remain in place. And I think that those will not be something that are negotiated away easily or lightly. So in some ways, President Biden sort of has a stacked deck that he walks in with, but I wouldn't expect to see big changes in trade, not least because our current account deficit with China continues to grow, which is a pain point.
Okay, thank you. How do you see the role of issues in Mideast and Turkey playing in the next decade or so?
I was involved in a conversation on this this morning with the former commander of U.S. Central Command and some others, and the answer is that the United States is going to have a lighter footprint in the Middle East, and it is going to try to keep itself out of conflicts in the Middle East to the degree that it can. Whether it gets pulled in the way that the Obama administration did after withdrawing from Iraq at the request of Iraqis back to fight ISIS, events on the ground have a way of dictating what happens in the Middle East. But I think overall there is a desire to reduce the role, first of all, of U.S. military forces in Middle East policy and the presence of U.S. forces in the Middle East, because as we saw, that was only a year ago when the Iranians attacked U.S. bases with ballistic missiles after we struck against their commander of their Quds force. We are a target in the Middle East to the extent that we're there, and our adversaries have increasingly lethal weapons that they can range against us, and they're not so afraid to use them as they might have once been.
Thank you. And could you maybe take a minute and just clarify for us on SolarWinds? Just help our audience understand the issue with the SolarWinds intrusion.
Yeah, so I think it was an ingenious hack in the sense that they went somewhere we weren't looking. They went through a piece of software that was sort of central to lots and lots of systems and gave people fairly unfettered access, and they were able to put themselves in the source code in a way that all of these fancy detectors that we have in the government and private sector didn't pick up. And it was only sort of when they were caught exploiting something from inside of the system that a private cybersecurity firm, FireEye, was able to trace back all of this to that source code software, sound the alarm bells, and tell everybody else in government and tech industry what had happened. A number of their customers as well, because they were basically, so they were piggybacking on trusted networks and trusted information. And what they've done, we don't even know. I mean, they're inside of electrical grids, they are inside of banking systems, they're inside of other kinds of financial data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics had to come out and say, we don't think SolarWinds corrupted the information we've been telling you about the US economy. And so there really is this sense that we don't know what we don't know about what the Russians have done, what they plan to do what they could still do. You may have noticed this week that the United States and Russia signed or are close to signing a 5-year extension of the New START nuclear arms control agreement to limit the number of deployed warheads. And the reason why we so readily agreed to do that with the Russians, the Biden administration did, and the Russians were so happy to do it, is because the relationship is in a terrible state. And we expect far greater conflict, we and the Russians do. And we wanted to put a floor in the relationship for both sides. So this is sort of a learned lesson from the Cold War, that you don't want things to get that bad that you're all of a sudden nuclear arms racing people. So it's a dire situation. And the timing of the information release certainly wasn't intentional by the Russians, because it makes things much more difficult with them, with the Biden administration, and it was already going to be a difficult relationship.
Okay, Sam, we've got 1 minute. I'm going to ask you a quick yes or no, and then I want to end on one that I think is a nice way to end. The yes/no question: will the dollar continue to be the world's reserve currency?
Yes.
Okay, and here's a great one to end on. Is there any good news?
Well, the good news is that if you live in a nursing home in most parts of the country, you've already received your COVID-19 vaccine. You don't have to fear for your life in the same way that you did even a month ago. And the rest of us are going to get that in coming months, and we are going to get back to normal. Even with all the fear mongering about different variants and stuff, the technology that's at the core of these two leading vaccines is incredibly flexible. We've learned an unbelievable amount about the virus as a scientific community in the past year. And I think the United States is going to help lead the recovery in a really pronounced way under this new administration, both domestically and internationally. It's going to be tough. It's going to take some time, but I think, we can come together as an international community rather than fragment. I think we've avoided some of the worst cases already.
Thank you, Sam. And now I'd like to turn it over to the chair of the World Affairs Council of Orange County, Nora Valenzuela, for closing remarks. Nora?
Thank you, Tom. Director Brannan, thank you so much for such an informative session. I certainly learned a lot, and I gotta say that your son walking into the room was very entertaining and delightful. Us having to do our activities virtually and online, a lot of the professionals are experiencing that, and I just think it's just a beautiful, the humanitarian touch of, taste of having the young boy.
It's encouraging for our future, isn't it, Nora?
Absolutely. I love it. I thought that was very cute.
He's about 2.5. So yeah, he's a little bit of a handful these days. You can't lock him down. So
totally understandable. Totally understandable. Thank you so much. I when we were talking about the carbon footprint, I work in the field of information technology, and one of the for the county and we work at the state level. And one of the challenges we've had as local government agencies are trying to bridge the digital divide while we are reducing the carbon footprint. They're almost mutually exclusive, because the more technology we put out there to bridge the digital divide and create a digital inclusion, is the more impact it's going to have on carbon footprint. However, there are organizations that are actually working on finding ways of being able to do both, which is recycling of technology rather than this culture that we have in America in throwing things away. Let's get a new one. It has one more features on it. Let's throw away the other one and get a new one. I know a lot of the vendors don't like that, but it's an interesting concept to really review. It's more of a psychological and sociological concept to review. So that's very interesting. Well, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Orange County, I wish to thank you and invite you to come back when we have in-person events, so you can join us, and we would have the honor of hosting you in person. We would also like to offer you our lifetime membership as our guests. So you will become a member of the World Affairs Council of Orange County, and it will be our honor for you to join us and actually see our other events in the future. So that would be great. And I wish to also thank all of our participants, Thomas, Rick, our staff, and also for Nassim to coordinating with the director on this very informative event. We thank all of our guests and wish all of you a healthy and safe afternoon. And we'll see you at our event coming up within the next couple of weeks. Please check out our website for the upcoming event. Thank you, sir, and have a safe afternoon, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Good
Thanks.
day,
Thanks,
everyone.
Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.